Kanui te mihi ki a koutou, ko tai mai nei I tēnei wā, a he mihi nui, he mihi mahana. Just to extend my warm greetings to all those who have come to join us here today, from us on the East Coast to everyone here. So a little bit of background and context. I realised the conference was titled E Tipu, Boma Agri Summit 2022. A famous leader from Ngāti Porou, Te Apirana Ngata, had a saying where he said, E tipu area mō ngā rā o tāwao. Essentially, it was a small piece of writing he gave to a young girl, and he talked about her growing up to fulfill the needs of her generation. The point about that piece of literature was it's about the generations to come. It's not about our generation, it's the generations to come. Being here, I'd also firstly like to acknowledge the mana whenua and the connection between Praurangi and Tahu Pōtiki. One of the themes I want to highlight is the importance of connection and relationships. Absolutely critical in Te Ao Māori. Another theme I want to highlight is, Rod said to me this morning, you're here to talk about fresh water, and we'd like a Māori perspective on fresh water. And I looked at him and I said, well, it's kind of contrary, Rod, to the way we think about the taiao, the environment. The taiao is simply part of the ecosystem we live in. We cannot talk about fresh water without considering land use. We cannot think about fresh water without thinking about the impacts on our marine environment. So that is the context that I will be addressing today. The final thing I want to comment on is I think our system for creating policies and regulations is broken. And I say it's broken because even today I see land uses that are inappropriate for the areas where then those land use activities are taking place. Here we are in Canterbury, where we have seen large-scale changes in land use enabled by our ability to extract water from the land. What happens when we start to deplete those water reserves? What happens when we start to pollute those underground water reserves that have taken millions of years to develop? We have land use in Southland, where in winter we're now trying to address questions around land use and winter grazing, and even in Auckland, where some of our best soils are being planted in houses. Is this really the foundation that we want to leave for those future generations? Tērā te haiata takiri ana mai ki ronga I o hikurangi. Ara whaiuru, whaiuru, whaiuru. Ara whai atu, whai atu, whai atu. Ara ratini, ara ri. Whiti ora ki te whaiao ki te ao marama. Whiti ki ronga, whiti ki raro. He ngungu ki te pohatu, he ngungu ki te rākau. Tītaha ki tēnei taha, tītaha ki tērā taha, tihei Moriora. That little tauparapara talks about the sun rising on my mountain Hikurangi. As darkness lifts, it exposes a landscape very, very different to the landscape my ancestors found when they voyaged to Tairāwhiti aboard the Waka Harauta. The land they arrived at was very different to what we see today. They came to a place where the trees were a bit like their homeland. They had plants, they had animals and birds and other species that they had to learn about. Over 30 generations, my ancestors gathered mātauranga about this place. They learned what foods could be harvested. They learned what were the impacts were of over-harvesting those traditional sources of food. It became for them a question of balancing the needs of the taiao with their very survival. We then fast forward to the late 1800s, early 1900s. And before I get into too much further detail, for the purposes of this presentation, just three concepts I want to explain in a bit more detail. When I talk about the taiao, I don't simply mean the environmental framing that's usually applied. I'm talking about the integrated ecosystem that is our land, our waterways, the plants on the land, and everything else about the tail. When I think about tikanga, I think about the rules and regulations that my ancestors learnt about over the 30-odd generations before Europeans came to this country. We learnt if we got it wrong, our existence was threatened. So what do we have? We fast forward to the late 1800s, early 1900s. On the east coast, we had massive clearance of bush. What we learned was we created a major ecological disaster on the east coast called erosion. As an interesting aside, this site is from Huirua Station, one of two large stations currently going through an OIO process where overseas investors want to buy this farm and convert it into trees. The problem we had with the erosion was that it entered the Mata River and eventually the Waipu River system and came off at a little place called Pohautia in Tikapa, where the contamination that entered the river ecosystem ended up doing this to our traditional food sources. It's interesting, after every fresh we get, we see more debris from forestry into the waterways. I can tell you the crayfish isn't very pleasant when it's got a slight piney flavour to it. We're seeing our traditional fishing beds destroyed. We're finding it much more difficult to harvest paua and kina. We have a system that's out of balance, not to mention the clearly ecological disaster that we see on our waterways. It was interesting, 1988, 30-odd years ago, we had Cyclone Bola. In response to some of the erosion problems we had on the East Coast, the government came out and established the East Coast Forestry Project, essentially a mechanism that allowed landowners to convert land from pastoral uses back into trees. On the face of it, that was a great move. Everyone supported and endorsed it, and we saw a reasonable uptake of funds that enabled that change in land use. What we didn't think about was 30 years after that change in land use, what might happen. So here we are, Tolaga Bay 2018. This became a relatively high-profile event where thousands and thousands of tonnes of forestry and debris entered the waterways and damaged many of the high-value flats around the East Coast community of Tolaga Bay. It wiped out a wool shed, it wiped out several houses, and the damage and impact was much more than what we might expect with a normal flood. 5 bridges were wiped out, and there's now a section of the road that's been closed and is unlikely to be reopened. The point in sharing this story with you is, first of all, we started with a country that was covered in trees. Sure, understand from a geological point of view, we're going to have some erosion. We cleared the land, we accelerated the erosion. We then decided to address it by planting pines. We created another type of problem. I think the way we do policy in New Zealand is flawed. The people who planted these trees are unlikely to be the people who experience and live with the problems that are being created. One of the things we advocate from a Te Ao Māori point of view is for a much more integrative approach. How do we decide where land needs to be planted in trees? We understand the commercial opportunities around pine. Are we doing things for the right reason, or are we simply adopting the Western model of costings, where it doesn't matter what the impact our land use activities have, so long as we make the maximum dollar? Now, I know it's a bit unjust to talk in generalities, and I acknowledge there are many non-Māori farmers who are driven by cultural values in much the same way as the Māori agribusiness sector is driven. And don't get me wrong, we like money. I regularly have sessions with the board who demand greater returns, but they expect those returns to be nuanced and balanced around making sure the land we leave, the water we leave, and everything else we touch is left in a better state for our children. Mō ngā uri ki te haramai, the future generations that we know in their time will be the guardians of the place that we leave. What we advocate for is a much more integrated land use. We understand we need to have a dairy industry. We understand we grow vegetables, we need places where we have houses. The challenge we have is deciding where in the landscape these types of development should occur. And I think that's the national discussion we need to have. It makes no sense at all that here in Canterbury, we enable a land use by irrigating through taking water from the ground, and we sort of ignore some of the other contaminant impacts of that land use. This is one of our properties where we have integrated land use, we've intensified, we have taken some of the grazing pressure off the hill countries, and we're doing a whole lot of work around making sure we address things like water quality. Now, we know our impacts are relatively minor. We know somewhere around 48% of what we call our total farming estate has already been converted to tree species. And we're very happy with that. And despite that, we are still taking out more land because we think it's in the best long-term interest of both the land and also the waterways. We're not opposed to irrigation. This is an irrigation scheme on a property close to Gisborne. This particular business has two properties. It has a large hill country property, roughly 30 kilometres inland from Gisborne on the Waipawa River system. Downstream, roughly 10 kilometres from the mouth of the Waipawa River, it has a second property where they do a lot of intensive land use, and they have pivot irrigations. One of the really cool things about the system you can see here is the inland property captures and stores and holds water. I think that reservoir is somewhere around 50 hectares in area. During times of water shortage, they release water into the Waipawa River. It travels through the river network, and somewhere around 80% of that water is then pumped from the Waipawa River into these dams. That system and design was the result of about 3 years of consultation between the landowners, between their whānau, and between the wider community. And believe me, we have issues with water availability in the Poverty Bay Flats. So we're not opposed to water use in these ways. In fact, we would encourage it. The issue for Māori tends to be we don't recognise the impact that has on others, and that's something that clearly is not sustainable. One of the other elements we need to recognise is often when you're dealing with the Māori agribusiness sector, we have around us owners, community, whānau, whose very existence relies on the ability to go out and to harvest traditional food sources. Eeling and all the freshwater life in our waterways has been our way of life for generations. It is always a concern of us when we hear from whānau that the quantity and the condition of eels in the waterways we influence is scarce, and the eels aren't good enough to consume. One of the important measures we have is making sure we have an abundance of fish life and that the quality of those animals thrives. Very important food source for us. One thing that is also easy to forget about is even in a region where we have Pakihiroa Station has 2,500 metres, the average rainfall on the East Coast is somewhere around 1,400 millimetres. In the last 12 months, we have had 3 100-year flood events. And many of you, I'm sure, would have seen the photos of Tokomaru Bay, where houses were flooded and where bridges were wiped out. It is hard to believe that in a country like this, we have parts of our communities where there is water poverty. On the East Coast, this is a water source, and I recently took people from the new Three Waters Commission there to have a look at this water source. This is the water source that is the emergency water supply for 3,000 families. Is that really acceptable in a country like New Zealand in 2022? Surely we have to have a better way of managing our water supply. This water source ran dry in the drought we had from 2019 to 2021. It's hard to imagine 3,000 households relying on water being trucked 2 hours from Gisborne up the East Coast. But it happens today. I think what we need is a cultural shift. Regulations do not work. Talking about limits is a waste of time. I've been trained in Western sciences, thank you very much, Lincoln University. When someone tells me, here's your nitrogen cap, or here's your limit, or here's how you use water, I can apply the training provided by the Western science system to work out how to do that and to operate within those limits. I can tell you now, when I take that approach back to the Pakihiroa board, or even our wider whānau or our shareholder base, the expectations are that we don't start with a mindset that says this is allowed. They expect us to adopt a culture of continuous improvement. How can you do better? I think that's a challenge for all of us here, because until we adopt a mindset that says we can all do better, we're going to be challenged by regulations that are responses to bad decisions that have already been made. We also need to remember that my generation will be making decisions that other generations will have to live by. And is that really going to be the legacy we leave for my kids and my grandchildren? I would certainly hope it's not. So just to conclude, ka ora te whenua, ka ora te whānau. When the whānau lives, the whenua lives. Tai pō, tai ao, tai awatea, tihei mauri ora. Kia ora.